Hi everyone, my name is Jack Stimson and I'm a second year doctoral student at the University of Tulsa. I'm in the clinical psychology program. I'm also a research assistant with the Interdisciplinary Institute of Trauma, Adversity, and Injustice, or as we call it, Titan. I also wanted to give credit to Dr. Lisa Cromer and the Sparta Lab for collaborating with Titan and coming up with this sleep talk. And the sleep talk is geared towards kids. However, it's going to be effective for young adults, adults, teenagers, older adults, as well as sleep strategies and information about sleep is pretty consistent across the lifespan. So today we're going to talk about the importance of sleep and do a little bit of psychoeducation around sleep, as well as talking about some sound sleep strategies that can help you maximize the amount of high quality sleep that you're getting. So before we begin, I want to direct you to a recent study that was conducted in the United States in 2014, which asked adults how many hours on average they get of sleep per night. And what they found was that Oklahoma was getting about, or 35 to 38% of people in Oklahoma reported getting fewer than 7 hours of sleep per night, even though it is recommended that adults get 7 hours or more of sleep per night for the best functioning and well-being and health. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the coming slides, but sleep affects our relationships and those around us, as well as work and school. And so if we're not going into work, what this means is that if we're not going into work or going to class feeling rested or even trying to do homework, it's only going to make all of that much harder to do. So why is good sleep important? Sleep affects numerous aspects of our functioning. So for example, it can affect our emotion regulation in the sense that poor sleep leads to problem behaviors, including tantrums. And we can see tantrums in kids as well as older adults when we're not getting enough good sleep. In terms of cognitive performance, we may see attention problems like an inability to pay attention and concentrate. We can also see that it impairs our memory and our learning as well. And so basically poor sleep means that we're less likely to follow instructions and we have a harder time learning academic concepts. Also, poor sleep is associated with increased susceptibility to injury and even illness. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides. Okay, so what else does sleep affect? Well, sleep is an extremely powerful tool, and it can do and help with many of the things that are about to come on the screen. So sleep has the power to increase learning and memory. It can also decrease impulsivity. It can improve health. It can assist in growth. It can even prevent injury and illness. It can reduce impatience, improve attention, and decrease irritability. It can also improve peer relationships as well as reduce fatigue. So this is the sleep-wake cycle, the normal sleep cycle. On the left is sleep onset, and then hours throughout the night on the x-axis here at the bottom of the screen. Throughout the night, we cycle from awake to stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and 4, and then into REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. And when we think of REM sleep, we want to think of the good stuff. So all of these sleep stages are important, but REM is the good stuff. That's the most important sleep. This is a time of night where important hormones are being released, as well as memory consolidation is happening, and really more of that cognitive piece. So in the summertime, if you've noticed, people grow and kids grow more in the summer. That's because we're getting more REM sleep. REM also helps with memory. It can also act like ibuprofen by healing damaged tissues. And so what you'll notice is that throughout the night, the REM sleep seems to increase. So if sleep is disrupted or you try to cram in extra naps to make up for lost sleep at night, you're actually going to get less REM sleep than if you sleep an entire 6 hours. So for example, let's say you sleep for 4 hours and then in the middle of the day you take a 2 hour nap. You're effectively going to lose much more REM sleep than if you slept for a full 6 hours rather than four and augmenting it with a 2 hour nap. So so 4 plus 2 doesn't actually equal 6 hours of sleep because you're going to lose some of that really important REM sleep if that happens. So what happens when we're not getting enough sleep? So there was a classic study that took healthy volunteers and monitored their sleep for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, they actually exposed them to the common cold virus. And after giving participants the virus, they monitored them for 4 additional days. And they actually sprayed them in the face with the virus. And what researchers found was that those participants who were sleeping fewer than 7 hours of sleep across those 2 weeks were 3 times more likely to get the cold. Plus, if they got less quality sleep, they were 5.5 times more likely to get a cold. And what less quality sleep means is that's our sleep efficiency. And that means that's a calculation of the amount of time we spend in bed asleep. So if it takes you an hour to fall asleep and you sleep for 7 hours, that's not going to be a great sleep efficiency. You want to spend about 20 minutes falling asleep and then get up as soon as your alarm goes off. That would be highly efficient sleep. And they found that those with poor quality or poor efficiency in their sleep were actually 5.5 times more likely to get the cold. So researchers can actually compare sleep deprivation to a rise in blood alcohol content level. So a number of researchers in research labs have examined this, and to do this, they randomly assign people to actually drink alcohol or be deprived of sleep. They have participants do a number of cognitive and motor tasks to find out at which point alcohol intoxication and sleep deprivation are equal or related. And they have found that 4 consecutive days with only 5 hours of sleep. So that's, imagine you have a deadline on Friday and you're sacrificing sleep each night until Friday to get that project done or study for that test. They found that those 4 consecutive days with only 5 hours of sleep was equivalent to operating at a blood alcohol content level of 0.05. And if you stay up for a full 24 hours without sleep, research shows that this is actually the equivalent to a blood alcohol content level of 0.1. So that would be like drinking 4, 5, 6 beers before a big game or before a big test. So why would you sleep deprive yourself, or why would you deprive yourself of sleep before a big test or a big game? And a lack of sleep like this also then leads to poor coordination, poor alertness, like this poor guy here. It also leads to an increase in hunger and decreased feelings of satiety or being full after you eat. So now we're going to start talking about ways to improve your sleep. Many of you guys have probably heard of circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are the same as a master clock in our brain. And this clock is controlled by our brain and causes 24-hour changes in body temperature, hormone levels, and other more complex processes. And during the day, our brain increases a chemical called cortisol, which alerts the body throughout the day. And then you can see here towards the night, these alerting chemicals decrease because at night our brain secretes a hormone called melatonin, which tells our body to prepare for bed and get sleepy. So like I said, this cycle is hardwired into our brain, and our body functions best if we keep this cycle consistent by going to bed at the same time each night and getting up at the same time each day. And since there are so many things that are tied to our biological clock, it's extremely slow to change. And this is why you might notice they can be so hard to get yourself up and out of bed on Monday mornings, because normally on the weekends we like to stay up later, and then that means we're getting up later, and that confuses this biological clock. It starts to think that we're changing our sleep routine, and so it can be pretty jarring to wake up early on Monday, and it can be really confusing to this circadian rhythm. So if you're going to change one thing based on today's presentation, you're going to get the most bang for your buck if you change this, if you change your sleep-wake cycle. And what I mean by this is if you're able to change getting up at the same time every day and going to sleep at the same time every day, this also includes the weekends. It's going to take a lot of diligence and repetition, but ultimately, because so many chemical processes are tied into this sleep-wake cycle, that you're going to function at your peak if you can keep this cycle consistent. And I know this is hard because on the weekends, everybody likes to sleep in. What can you do instead? Well, you can get up early on the weekends and do that binge watching of TV shows or reading or video games. You can do that in the morning when you wake up on the weekends rather than staying up really late doing those same things. So you can kind of shift when you do those activities, and that can be helpful in keeping this sleep wake cycle consistent. So part of creating a good cycle, a good sleep cycle, can be done by developing a peaceful bedtime routine that's the same each night. And that can help us regulate our sleep-wake cycle as well. So we can actually teach our brain to feel sleepy and relaxed when we do certain things over and over and over. So when we have cues for bedtime, we can teach our body to release that sleepy chemical melatonin that I mentioned before. So now let's look at a bedtime routine that can help us with this. And again, this is geared towards littler kids, but this can also be applicable for adults of all ages. So in a bedtime routine, sometimes we have to remind somebody to put on their PJs, or it takes us a long time to put on our PJs. And then maybe we're playing games on our phone or on an iPad, and then one game turns into 3 games. And then maybe we drank too much water, and now we have to go to the potty, or we have to go to the bathroom. The back rub might extend for a long period of time, and by that time, we're way past our normal lights out time. So basically, the most important thing is keeping a bedtime routine consistent, where you spend the same amount of time doing each of the above things. So limiting maybe your screen time to 1 game rather than 3 games, and keeping that consistent to really train our brain to cue ourselves that it's time for bed. So when we do the same thing over and over, like putting on our pajamas and then eating a snack and then brushing our teeth and then getting into bed, the more we do that, the more we're going to cue our brain that it's time for sleep and it's time for bed. And that's going to trigger the release of melatonin earlier and earlier into our bedtime routine, so that maybe even after just putting on our pajamas, we're already feeling pretty sleepy and ready to fall asleep as soon as we get into bed. So like I mentioned before, this routine, if we keep it the same each night, we can create a powerful signal for the brain that it's time to wind down and get ready for bed. You can create a bedtime routine like the one on the left here, and feel free to change whatever you want. But the goal of this presentation is to get you to start thinking about simple things you can change one at a time, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But by keeping a simple bedtime routine, Again, the key is that it's signaling our brain that it must be time for bed. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about specific sleep strategies that we can use to get the best amount of sleep and the best quality sleep. One thing we can do is make a sleepy environment in the bedroom that also can teach our brain to feel sleepy. So our environment around us sends the signal that when I'm going to bed, it's time for sleep, and the room being dark and cool and quiet and comfortable will allow our body to really know and understand that it's time for sleep, and it'll be able to trigger that melatonin release. And by doing that, it'll signal that it's time for bed and not other activities. So one thing we can do is we can make our beds super comfortable. Um, if we have things on our bed that make it uncomfortable, like clothes or like a backpack, we can remove that stuff. If you're living in a dorm, you can be kind of restricted in terms of what things you can do to make a comfy bed, but you can always invest in a really comfy duvet or blanket. You can get a mattress topper for pretty cheap that can make your bed much comfier. You can invest in some nice pillows to really make it as comfortable as possible, even if you're living in a dorm. Also, it's important to keep your room a cool temperature. So the optimal temperature for sleep is actually around 65 degrees. So um, it's recommended that adults be anywhere from the room be anywhere from 60 to 67 degrees. And for kids, it's a little bit warmer, but 60 to 67 degrees for adults, and that helps trick our brain into staying asleep longer. Because as you start to wake up, your body temperature rises, and by keeping your body temperature cooler, you're able to sleep longer and more soundly before waking up. Low lights can also be really beneficial because low lights, rather than those bright fluorescent lights, also create a more relaxing sleep environment. Bright lights suppress melatonin and send the signal to our brain that we're awake, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to create. Um, it can also be, I also want to mention that in terms of the cool temperature, it can be important to have layers of sheets and blankets because our body temperature changes throughout the night. And so we want to be able to make ourselves not too hot and not too cold and in a really comfortable spot. We also want to ensure that the bedroom and the sleeping environment is as quiet as possible. And so using earplugs to potentially make the sleep environment quieter, or using a white noise app on your phone, or even using like a $10 box fan from Target can be really helpful in creating a peaceful um, sleep environment that's going to allow you to sleep throughout the night rather than being woken up by roommates or by a pet. So those are some things to consider as well. This also means try to avoid doing activities in bed that send the signal of being awake. So, watching television, being on your phone, eating a snack, playing video games, these are all things that can mess up the connection between the bed and sleeping. We want to cue our body that our bed is used for sleep only. We don't want our bed to be associated with um, other activities. And that way we can cue our brain to know that when we're in bed, it's time to be sleeping. So the goal also is to try to avoid using, watching, playing video games or screens or electronics while in bed. A better alternative is to have a beanbag chair or a desk or something where you can use your electronic devices that's physically separated from your bed. The best, ideally, we'd want to have a TV or electronics moved out into another room. That's not always or that's not always the way it happens, especially in dorm rooms. And the idea behind this is, like I mentioned before, is a concept of classical conditioning, and we want to train ourselves to automatically feel sleepy when we're getting into bed. And so these other behaviors that might happen on the bed or in the bed, such as watching TV, playing video games, and eating, get in the way of conditioning our brain to automatically feel sleepy when we get into bed. So, um, to recap, basically using electronics away from your bed as much as possible will be most beneficial in creating a in classically conditioning yourself to be cued that your bed is a place for sleep and not other behaviors. Another important key to a consistent sleep wake cycle is trying not to stay in bed for longer than 20 minutes if you're not falling asleep. So, again, the reason for this goes back to the association between the bed and sleep that we're trying to create. So, if you're tossing and turning and feeling really anxious in bed, or you've had the experience where you get really angry when you can't fall asleep, I know I've had that experience. We want to make sure that our bed isn't associated with a place of worry or anger. So, what we recommend is hitting the reset button after 20 minutes. So, by hitting the reset button, you aren't saying that it's time to go watch a movie or play or get up and do something really emotionally and physically stimulating, but rather it's a chance to redo. And what you should be doing is something that's quiet and relaxing. Um, you can go into another room and write down what's on your mind. You may say a prayer, you might meditate, you might read a book. If you want to do really relaxing yoga and stretching, something that's going to relax you rather than arouse you, um, that can be a great reset after those 20 minutes. And so the goal is, after you do some of these relaxing activities and you start to feel sleepy again, then you try again to go back to sleep. And if you can't get back to sleep after 20 minutes, hit the reset button again. So we've been talking a great deal about bedtime routines and creating a sleep-inducing environment. Now I want to discuss what should be part of the bedtime routine, including the activities that occur before bed. An important concept to know is that there are several problems with screen time, especially before bed. So the presence of a television and the frequent use of electronics has been related to delayed bedtimes, less time in bed, shorter total sleep, and increased bedtime resistance. So you're going to be reducing sleep quality as well as sleep quantity. So media use in the evenings may also cause people to become physiologically aroused, making it more difficult for them to relax prior to bedtime. And additionally, the electromagnetic radiation from television or computer screens may suppress melatonin and actually delay their circadian rhythm. As well as the electromagnetic radiation from mobile phones has been found to change sleep architecture as well. And those bright lights from television or computer screens can also delay some of that melatonin and decrease the sleepiness. So try to resist the urge to use TVs and computers at least 1 hour before bedtime. Um, and the American Sleep Academy actually recommends 2 hours before bed, but as students, that might not be realistic. So we recommend 1 hour before bedtime if possible. So like I said, stop TV and computer use 1 to 2 hours before bed. So as part of your bedtime routine, you can replace that TV or screen time that you do right before bed with some other relaxing activities. Like I said before, it's important to avoid arousing activities before bedtime. Like homework can be really stress inducing and arousing. Competitive games, um, or other activities that might cause dispute or arguments or arousal can be the opposite of relaxing and can be harder for us to make it harder for us to fall asleep. So consider replacing those stressful activities with more relaxing ones like, you know, relaxing yoga poses, quiet reading, or even a warm bubble bath. We recommend that if you're going to do a bubble bath or a warm shower, doing it as early in your sleep routine as possible so that your body temperature decreases as a result. So it can be hard to fall asleep with a high body temperature that if you tried to go to sleep right after a hot shower, it might be hard because your body temperature is high. So do it as early as you can in your sleep routine, but that can also be something that's really relaxing. So trying to replace and increase these relaxing activities in your sleep routine can be conducive to um, conditioning your brain into getting ready for sleep and relaxation. Also, another factor that relates to sleep quality is what we eat. And while it may seem like it's common sense to reduce foods that will increase our energy before bed, there are many foods that contain stimulating properties that you might not necessarily know or think about. So, chocolate and fruit juices are two examples. Chocolate contains caffeine, um, and fruit juices often contain a lot of hidden sugar that can actually increase our energy. It's also important to note that caffeine can remain in the body on average 3 to 5 hours, but they can affect some people up to 12 hours later. So it's helpful to try to stop eating sugary treats at least 2 to 4 hours before bedtime and avoid caffeine 6 to 8 hours before going to bed. And these can help improve our sleep quality as well. Okay, so let's review what we talked about today. So we've talked about a lot. So we know that sleep can affect many aspects of our behavior, and that behavioral problems and emotional problems may actually be due to poor sleep. So, sleep has the power to improve learning, increase growth, help with our health and injuries, as well as reduce irritability. When it comes to sleep, consistency is key. A peaceful bedtime routine and sleepy environment can send powerful signals to the brain that tell it that it's time for bed. Also, it's important to reduce screen time and sugary foods before bed, while at the same time um, increasing relaxing activities. And four, sometimes there are problems in children's sleep that, or excuse me, change one thing at a time and keep it simple. You don't want to have to try to change everything all at once because that can be overwhelming and make it harder for us to stick to that routine. So, looking to change one thing at a time and keep it simple. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And here are my references. Thank you for tuning in to the talk.